Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to the second, iteration of Ask Zajef Xiao edition. First things first, what is his overall place on the meta, pull value when compared to the other 3.45 stars, and how much has changed since Volume 1? His overall place in the meta is that he's not a very meta unit. He's one of those units that, in terms of power, he's meh. In terms of pull value, he's pretty bad. But he does have a few things going for him that, in my opinion, make him slightly more valuable than a few of the other hypercarries that you could go for. Out of the hypercarries, I think he's the one that I would rather have, generally. And that's due to a few reasons. The main reason for it is the way that he deals with AoE situations. Basically, when you're dealing with like multi-wave stuff of enemies that are like not too squishy, but not too tanky either, and stuff like events generally, right? You look at, for example, the potion event, you look at energy amplifier, and a lot of the events like that where you can have like multiple waves of somewhat squishy but not that squishy enemies. He can end up outperforming what you'd expect out of someone who has the DPS that he has, basically. He has a lot of practicality in situations like that of multi-wave AoE content. And that's not something that is necessary at all. Honestly, very, very, very far from it. And I don't think he's a unit that you really need to have on your account in any sense of the word need. But he does have a tiny little bit of value in a few of those events that make him not completely useless in terms of pull value. I want to make it very clear, right? This isn't something that matters that much at all, but it is like honestly his biggest upside. He's also a pretty straightforward unit to play and it's very easy to consolidate his AoE, which means that for more casual players that don't really want to bother learning enemy attack patterns to group them properly, he can also overperform a bit. And how much has changed in terms of his pull value since the last edition of Ask Zajef Xiao edition, and his power? Honestly, not that much. Faruzan has obviously made him stronger, but some of the value that he provides, right, with the like easy to consolidate AoE and stuff like that, isn't as necessary now with Dendro, because Hyperbloom teams can kind of just get such high output at such low investment that you'll never really need to have a good AoE team to deal with AoE stuff. Faruzan has made him a little bit better, but not that much if you don't have her C6. And if you have her C6, you probably also have like a fucking C2 Wanderer, so you might not want to go for Xiao. We don't have either leaks or like confirmation on which 4 stars are going to be on the banner yet as of recording this video, but assuming that Faruzan is not there because she's been on Wanderer's banner very, very like not long ago, then it's going to be very hard to get high constellation Faruzan. And at that point, Faruzan can work with him. At C2, I believe, she becomes a lot better than at C0 for him because it makes her burst last longer, and that makes it so that you can stay on Xiao for longer. You don't have to cut your rotations short to get good uptime on this. All in all, like if you have a low constellation Faruzan, she's not particularly good with Xiao. She's gonna help you have your number be bigger, but there's an argument to be made to just not use her at all if she's on C6. Even though at C2, like there's definitely also an argument to be made to use her. How is his pull value and strength compared to the other hypercarries, and how much did Dendro and Faruzan affect it? That ties into what we talked about a little bit, but there's not actually that many hypercarries. Like you look at the characters that people call hypercarries, and a lot of the time they're not actually hypercarries. Like some people will call Hu Tao a hypercarry, and while like she can kind of function as one, a lot of people play her in like double hydro teams where she's barely half of the team's DPS unless you start getting her 5-star weapon or constellations, right? And at that point it's like it's hard to define hypercarry in a way that's going to leave everyone satisfied. But if we define hypercarry as just like units that need to stay on field for very long and can't swap out during their uptime, you've got like Wanderer, Sino, I guess, Ito, Xiao. Between all of those, Xiao is pretty middle of the pack. He's definitely not the worst one, but he's also definitely not the best one. He's just a functional one. He's also one of the hypercarries that scales the least well with dolphin level monetary investment, I guess. And usually when people try to force hypercarries, very often it's because they really love a character and they'll go for constellations. And with Xiao, like C1 is fine, I guess. C2 to C5 are fucking garbage. And so a lot of those other 5-star hypercarries have relatively early constellations that improve them, which means that at that level of comparison, he'd be outperformed by them. What are some of Xiao's team's advantages and disadvantages over other hypercarries teams, especially with similar units like Sino, Ito, and Wanderer? His one and only real advantage is how well he consolidates his AoE. If you look at Ito, the way that his AoE works, it's mostly in front of him, and the range on it is not all that great. But in exchange for that, he doesn't stagger enemies too much, and so the stagger won't ungroup very light enemies like Geovishaps or Bathismal Vishaps that get knocked all the way to Narnia from the slightest stagger. Wanderer's like charge attacks have a decent-ish AoE, but they do stagger enemies outwards, and his normal attacks have pretty garbage AoE. But because Wanderer's normal attacks, they are like auto-targeted, you can't aim them like in a way that it's going to be on the outside of all the enemies. So if I open paint real quick, if you've got 3 enemies, one here, one here, one here, if you use Wanderer's charge attack, it's always going to be centered on one of these 3 enemies, depending on what enemy, and like if they're in the middle of an attack, it's either going to do like, if it targets on him, in terms of your stagger, it might just do like this, this, and this. Or it could also do this or this, depending on exactly like where the enemy is. But point being, you're kind of guaranteed to ungroup the enemies to some extent. With Xiao, because you get to decide where you plunge, you can plunge like here, and that's gonna make this enemy go there, this enemy go there, and this enemy go there. And it does like spread them out a little bit, but not that much. And then Sino just doesn't have the greatest AoE either. With the size of his AoE, like decent size on his E, but not great on his normal attacks. All of this to say, there's gonna be a bunch of different like situations where the hypercarry that can consolidate his damage against multiple enemies the best is going to be Xiao. It's not always the case. It depends on the types of enemies you're fighting, but it somewhat often is, and that's his biggest upside over the other hypercarries. His main disadvantage is that Xiao is a unit that can generate front-loaded energy, right, with his double E, and often you're going to play him either with Faruzan or Sucrose, whatever, right? But he can generate front-loaded energy, which means that it can be hard to decide on like how much ER you actually want to go for him. Because if you can kill enemies in one burst, you don't need to get that much ER. Yeah. So as you can see, right, I can pre-funnel my energy. And again, don't look at the damage. We're on a fucking Beginner's Protector and we don't even have full artifacts. Which means that if I can kill the enemy in 2 bursts, oh, fuck off. Here, there one of his E's got bugged, but still. I can get my burst back, like basically back to back, but as you can see this time, because I didn't pre-funnel my E's, because I needed to get the E's to get the second burst, then I'm gonna finish with like no energy, but then the third burst is gonna take a lot longer to get. So you kind of gotta choose, like, are you gonna build an amount of ER that you need to get like 2 bursts, which against a lot of enemies is more than enough damage to kill the chamber, but against some enemies that have like stalling mechanisms, it won't be. Or are you gonna build more ER? And if you build more ER like that, it obviously is going to hurt his damage output. So that can be one of the disadvantages that he has. Because he is very burst reliant, if you need to do that, right, like how you have to build more ER, and that can hurt the amount of like offensive stats that you can get. Out of the hyper carries, if you end up not playing them as a hyper carry, Xiao is probably the best one at that. You can play Xiao in non-hyper carry teams sometimes. You can play Hyper Bloom Xiao, and you can play like VV Favlance National Xiao, and those are actually like decent-ish teams. But like that doesn't really go into it too much. I mean, I can show you guys Xiao Lab. Why not? Oh, come on. Fucked up my pre-funnel a little bit, but it is what it is. And it lets you see Xiao's beautiful attack animations, which is nice. But yeah, so that's something you can do, which is like It's not great, obviously, but it is a funny thing you can do with them. It actually works better in AoE than it does in single target, because of the way that the gauge works with swirls, you kind of end up losing your electro at some point this way, which is a bit unfortunate, but anyways. Can you address some misconceptions about Xiao, and is it true that Xiao's single target output is bad when he cannot bonk his target? Xiao isn't necessarily like great in single target, obviously, but he's not as bad as a lot of people think he is because of this thing right here. So you can see, right, when you look at the multipliers for plunge attacks, you have plunge damage and then low and high plunge damage. When you're doing a plunge attack, this is the main number that you'll see, right? Either low or high depending on how hard you are. But you can actually hit enemies mid-air with your plunge attack, with the collision of it, and if you do, you'll get this number on top of this one, which is up to like 50% more DPS if you're doing like short plunge spam, but generally more like 35 to 40% more DPS. Not every enemy has a hitbox that works with that collision plunge or that bonk, but enemies that do can end up taking more damage. Like, now he's still in the EM build right now, so again, right, the damage isn't the point, it's just like the mechanic. Right, 2 animal numbers. Oh, only one there because I wasn't close enough to him. Oops, only one there again, but yeah. You can see, right, I'm getting 2 on most of my plunges, and that's the bonk. And that can increase his DPS quite a bit, right? If you don't get that, his single target DPS is honestly not that great. But if you do, then it becomes pretty okay, pretty acceptable. What are some other misconceptions about Xiao? I guess honestly about his C6. People think his C6 is like insane. It's not. His C6 so often isn't even that big of a damage increase, even in AoE. Let's open up the paint again. When you have one enemy, you jump up, you plunge, very cool, up, down, up, down, very cool, all right? And you get your plunge damage. When with C6, you don't get C6 procs, so it's the same thing, right? You get the damage once when there's one enemy. When there's 2 enemies, without C6, you jump up, down, and all that. So when there's 2 enemies, each of your plunge hits the enemies twice for 2 instances of damage. With C6, you'll jump up, down, and then you'll start E-spamming. The reality though is that not every single one of your E's is gonna hit both enemies. More realistically, what's gonna happen is about half of your E's are gonna hit both and the other half are only gonna hit one. It is still a pretty significant damage increase, and you end up basically getting your plunge, right, which is 2, and then instead of another plunge, you get like 3 or 4 E's, which gives you almost twice the DPS on your primary target and closer to 1.5 times against your secondary target, right? So it's close to like 3.5-ish times. But the thing is, when you start getting to 3 enemies, your E cannot physically go through all 3, right? There is no line that passes through all 3 of these points. Like that just, it doesn't work. And so you would get your plunges usually, sure, but with C6, you get your plunge, and then instead of your second plunge, instead of like getting the wow, massive, insane damage increase, well, you'd only get the damage increase on like 2/3 of the enemies. So instead of doubling, it's closer to like around 4. And when you start getting to even more enemies, what you'll notice is this doesn't really go up. And effectively, what ends up happening is the more enemies you're up against, the worse Xiao's C6 becomes. And when there's a lot of enemies, you actually get to a point where it's better to just spam plunge attacks even with C6. Now, having access to the C6 means that when there's a lot of enemies, if there's one enemy that's tankier than the others, you can C6 spam on him. And that's obviously a pretty massive increase in like clear speed. It also means that you'll always finish your burst with all 3 stacks of your E back up. And if you time your stuff properly, you can even like get some additional free E's after your burst expires from the C6 that will generate energy. And so it helps with your energy requirements as well. But in terms of actual damage output, there are actually a lot of situations where it doesn't really help you as much as a lot of people think it does. It's still good, but it's not actually that insane. There's some constellations on other 5 stars that give you as much of a DPS increase as Xiao's C6, but without a condition. And like at that point, is Xiao's Constellation 6 good? Yeah. But because all of his constellations on the way to C6 are just basically fucking garbage, then some characters that have C6s that are just as good, but also good constellations on the way, like Yelan or something, kind of just make his constellations look like a joke. So all of this to say, his C6 is good, but it's probably overestimated by some people, for sure. What's another misconception about him? I guess something that ties into another question that I saw earlier, which is how shield dependent he is. Xiao can be shield dependent, but one of the nice things about him is that there's not that big of a difference in DPS between the few combos that he can do. Right? Usually the different combos you can do is like You can just do plunge attack. You want to like plunge instantly as soon as you hit the high plunge threshold, whatever. Right? You can also do N1 plunge. Right? You can do charge attack plunge spam. Right? What people call the jet combo. You can just spam low plunges because you don't want to bother. And the difference in damage between those combos is pretty low, but the biggest difference between those combos is that their timings are different. They're not difficult to execute, but the timing on when you jump is different, which can be a pretty big deal because that means you can use different combos to time your jump to dodge attacks. There we go. Oh, fuck. Anyways, hopefully you get the idea. I'm obviously not very fucking good at the game, but if you play Xiao a lot, if you can get a lot of practice with them, you can start like alternating your combos to dodge enemies' attacks, which makes his reliance on shields not nearly as important as a lot of people think it is. Speaking of Wanderer, which of the two would I recommend over the other, and which of the two is more free-to-play friendly? I mean, I wouldn't recommend either. There is no hypercarry that's good enough to justify going for a hypercarry playstyle, like considering how fucking broken so many of the supports are. If I had to choose between the two, I would definitely go for Xiao. In terms of just like baseline output, Xiao just does more. They have different weaknesses. So Wanderer obviously has the like, well, he has the overworld stuff, right? Which is obviously pretty significant for a lot of people. And when you're up against very mobile enemies, like the PMA, like the Golden Wolf Lord, Wanderer can hit them because his thing auto-targets even in the air, whereas Xiao just can't. But when you're in AoE situations, Xiao just heavily outshines Wanderer. Depending on what you care about more, you can kind of just go for either. Neither of them is a character that you pull for because they're optimal. They're both characters that you pull for because you like them. When Wanderer was initially released, we had the like 4 husks in Abyss, and for that Abyss, I think it is very, very hard to 36 star with Wanderer, even with decent investment on him, unless you have like C6 Faruzan. You could obviously mitigate that by just using Venti and having Venti carry you. But when Wanderer is in like AoE situations against enemies that can get knocked away from each other, the amount of investment that he needs to meet the DPS thresholds can just be too much, to the point that it's unrealistic to expect someone to be able to get them without a way to mitigate that, like using Venti, which not everyone has, unfortunately. Comparatively, in this current Abyss, playing Xiao against the PMA, unless you have a really good second side, you're also going to struggle to 36 star. And so that's kind of just where it ends up, where both of them can end up just struggling against different types of things. So neither of them is like an amazing unit overall. And yeah, honestly, that's kind of it. Artifact set overview. Differences between set combinations. Does he have a true clear-cut best in slot? And how is the Desert Pavilion Chronicle on him? And are there other more gimmicky sets he can run? As a general rule, he doesn't have one set that's always above the others because he has like basically 2 sets that are generally quite good. He has Vermilion and he has the like Wanderer set, right? The Pavillon. Vermilion gives him a lot of attack percent and Pavillon gives him a lot of damage percent. So basically, if you're running Bennett and a bunch of sources of external attack buffs, then that makes Vermilion less good. Whereas if you're running Faruzan and a bunch of damage percent buffs, that makes Pavillon less good. Either can be better depending on what team you're running, but I would say that generally when it comes to hyper carries, you really like being able to run them with Bennett. And if you run them with Bennett, then Pavillon is slightly better, but it is a single digit percentage, and 2-piece Pavillon, 2-piece VV, or 2-piece VV, 2-piece attack is not actually that far behind either. It's also a single digit percentage. And if you're not running any attack buffs, Vermilion can be like about 10% above 2-piece options. Honestly, like realistically, the damage difference between like his optimal set in a given situation and a 2-piece is never more than like 10%. And Vermilion set is with the Echo set that basically no one uses. And Vermilion is not a set that you use on anyone other than him. And the Pavillon set is with the like flop set that's only good if you want to like get your Hyperbloom teams a single digit percent damage increase on your stuff as well, because you're going to need to farm Deepwood, so you're going to get gilded on the way, which means that once you've got got your Gilded and your Deepwood, it's not that great to farm for Flowers of Paradise Lost set, but it's not bad either, so you can do it. Either way, like, realistically, if you're going for Xiao, it's because you really like him, not because he's great. And so if that's the case, like, you can farm for one of his sets, but one of the factors that goes into Pavillon being recommended, in my opinion, is that passively farming the Flowers of Paradise Lost set is better than passively farming Echoes, because Echoes just sucks. I hate Echoes. And then, are there other more gimmicky sets he can run? Yeah, so he can run VV. Depending on what team he's in, there's going to be some times where he wants to run VV. If the rest of his team has a lot of personal damage and can get increased by VV, you can run him on VV. You can run him as a solo animal unit with 5 lengths with VV. And that can work. It's fine. It's not great, but meh. How much attack percent is too much on him? There's never such a thing as too much of a good stat. The more stats, the better. It's just that once you start having a lot of attack percent, then that makes damage percent more valuable, because your damage percent is increasing a bigger attack number, whereas your attack percent is still increasing your number based on your base attack, which doesn't change. It's not that you don't want to stack too much attack percent, it's that if you are given the choice, once you have a lot of attack, you'd rather get damage percent or crit, if you can, over more attack percent. But there's no such thing as too much attack percent. Like, just get as much as you can. Weapon overview. How do his weapon options stack up to each other in general, and explain why you think Fao's an underrated choice for him, and is Missive Wind Spear a good free-to-play weapon for him? Let's start with the last question. Yes, Missive Wind Spear is a good free-to-play option on him. He actually has a good free-to-play option now, thanks to Missive Wind Spear, so that's good. However, Missive Wind Spear is a lot of attack percent, which means that if you start getting a Bennett, if you start getting TDDS, you start getting a lot of external attack buffs, then that makes its power relative to the other potential weapons you can have less great. All in all, though, it's still a pretty solid option. Without any external attack buffs, it actually performs pretty close to like the good 4-star options like Deathmatch and Blackcliff. But then once you start stacking attack buffs, it starts falling a little bit short. Next up, why is Fav an underrated choice for him? Fav's single-handedly solves your energy requirements. The amount of ER you get from it isn't that much. If you want to go for like more than 2 rotations, you want to be ready for shit, generally you're going to need a little bit more than 130. I mean, it depends on the team, obviously, but especially if you're playing something like a non-C6 Faruzan and you just don't generate that much energy, then your requirements can go to like 140, 150 even. But with the passive from Fav, you just fix that. But then on top of that, you also generate energy for the rest of your team, which means that you don't have to build any energy recharge in your substats, which lets you obviously have more offensive substats. It's not always a better option, like at all, but it basically gives you almost always more ER than what you actually need. And having more ER than you need is good to prepare you for when you fuck up. And also when the enemies decide to be cringe, right? Like the PMA, sometimes you use your E, but the PMA's hitbox is fucked, so it doesn't actually hit the PMA. Like, you get stopped by the PMA, but it doesn't actually deal the damage, nor does it generate the energy. Well, with Fav, because you have a little bit more ER than you need, that's not actually that big of a deal. Also, and like most importantly, because you generally have to build a few ER subs, it makes it so that Fav, at a baseline, because it lets you not have to do that, isn't actually very far behind the other 4-star options. It's a lot closer than what many people would expect. And then that makes the like added comfort of it very often worth it, and worth just running Fav over the other 4-star options if you have it. And one of the other very nice upsides to it is you can get Fav from the gacha system without having to like actively try to go for it. Unlike weapons like Lithic, unlike Blackcliff that you need to actually like spend Star Glitter on, which sometimes you want to spend your Star Glitter on something, unlike Deathmatch that you need to buy the battle pass for, which means that it's actually possible that you have a Fav lens already, and it makes Fav one of his potentially good weapons for people who don't want to have to buy a battle pass for him. Although Missive Wind Spear has made that a little bit less like necessary, but not everyone has played during that event, so not everyone has the Missive Wind Spear. Another advantage for Fav lens that I haven't talked about too much is that Xiao often feels like shit in Overworld because he's a burst focus unit, and what often happens in Overworld is the enemies die before you get your burst back. That means you're starting the next enemy camp without energy, and Fav's clear particles help you a lot with that. And then how do his weapon options stack up to each other in general? So I guess all that's left is to talk about the 5-star options. The 5-star options are generally like a decent bit ahead of the 4-star options. They function a lot like the artifact sets do, in the sense that if your weapons give you a lot of attack percent, they're very good if you're not running Bennett and a lot of external sources of attack, but if you are, then they start falling off a little bit. Right? Like if you're not running Bennett, stuff like Calamity Queller, stuff like Vortex Vanguard, Vanquisher can actually be quite good. But if you are, they start losing out to the crit focused weapons. His general best option, if you're below 50% HP, is Homa, but because he works so well with Bennett, it can be hard to stay under 50% HP because Bennett's going to heal you back up. When you are playing him with Bennett, generally Jade Spear or Staff of Scarlet Sands are a little bit better, but all in all, like, there's not a significant difference between any of his 5-star options. You can play him on Skyward Spine or Engulfing, and they help with ER requirements a little bit, but they're not that great generally, unless you need a lot of ER with Engulfing. Regarding his best in slot Jade Spear, is it good on any other polearm users besides him? So Jade Spear is not necessarily his best in slot. Like, it's one of his potential best in slot options, depending on who you end up playing him with and all that. It is a good option on him, but it's not like a clear best in slot for sure. But I guess it's kind of like his signature weapon because it's like visually, it looks like it should be his weapon. Is it good on anyone else? Well, the short answer is no. It's not that it's a bad weapon, like it's still a 5-star crit weapon, which means that it can't be bad. But if you look at the users that you can have for it, right? Xiangling, Jade Spear's effect, you can only stack it up while you're on field, and it snapshots, which means that in order to get the effect on Xiangling, you have to fully stack it before you use your burst, which slows you the fuck down so much. Very often, it's not that great on Xiangling. On John Lee wants 5 most of the time, and if you play him as a burst bot, he's also often not gonna get like a lot of stacks on it. It's fine on a Hu Tao, but because Hu Tao doesn't care about the base attack that much, it's not really above a high refined Dragon's Bane. It's kind of just like close to it, or a high refined Deathmatch. Rosaria has the same issue as Xiangling, whereas she snapshots, and you don't want to have to stack it before you use burst. It's fine on Raiden, but Raiden also has catch. It's not very good on Toma. It's not good on Yunzin. It's not very good on Shenhe because Shenhe wants 5. It's not very good on Kondaka. And it is actually a pretty decent option for Sino. I mean, that's what I have him on, right? When I play my Sino, I use him on Deathmatch. And it is a pretty good option on him, but it's not like insane either. So it can be fine on Sino, and it can be just like an okay stat stick on a few other polearm users, but it's never like that great. Not something you're particularly happy with. What artifact sets would you put on Sucrose, Faruzan, or Jean in the Xiao team? If Faruzan is C6, you give her TOM because her C6 procs are skill damage and they can proc TOM, and that's good. With Faruzan, if she's not C6, you might need the ER, so you might just want to go 2-piece emblem. Other than that, though, Noblesse is good. I guess you can run Exile on like your Sucrose if you manage to have enough ER to get your burst anyways, but yeah. Why is Xiao 2 sauces tall, and does he become taller at friendship level 10? 2 sauces? What? Zajef slander. Oh, I see. Birdie Bird. I see. Let me go check something, actually. I wonder if I can find it. Oh, did you find it? Yes! During the Chasm quest, we had a frame that had both Ushi and Xiao, so I just took Xiao and like tried to calculate how tall Ushi was with the measuring unit being Xiao's. And Ushi is canonically 5.5 Xiao's tall. So yeah, I hope that helps. Does he become taller at friendship level 10? No, but there's a cool little effect where he actually brainwashes you into thinking that he is taller. That's actually one of his Yaksha powers. That's why Zajef think that Xiao is tall. It's not because he's coping. It's literally not his fault. So be nice to him, okay? It's not his fault. He can't help it. That does it for the Xiao Asks Zajef. So thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you learned a thing or two. Don't forget to lament and lament. You can check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/lament. Yeah, I'll see you guys around. Bye, YouTube.
Disappear! Yeah, boring! Here! Worthless! Lament!
Can we add this to the video? Oh, god damn it. Alright. John, it's time to go get some lemon. Lament!